we want to move on to the next panel discussion, which is going to kind of take what you've learned about some of the technical components of aquifer science, and then the management, how it is that the management metrics are set up, and have a discussion about the impacts of production in the Carrizo-Wilcox. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to your moderator, Robert Banks, who you already know, to introduce this panel. Robert?
Thank you. And just a heads up to the slide guy, Kevin Spencer is going to be first. He's getting the slides ready to go. As you heard me speak this morning, I talked about when you pump a well and you get a water level decline. Anytime you take water from an aquifer, produce water from an aquifer, it's going to have consequences to the aquifer. Consequences is, I don't want to be judgmental about it. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's a thing. You pump a well, something's going to happen to the aquifer. Water levels go down. It's possible it could have an impact on a neighbor's well if that cone of depression interacts with the neighbor's cone of depression, depending where the pumping is occurring, how much in the aquifer, may have consequences on stream flow, base flow to streams, things of that nature. Could be consequences or impacts to other aquifers. Again, I'm not passing judgment on it. Our agency is neutral on this, but it is something that happens. It's reality. When you pump, there's a consequence. So the purpose of this panel is to have a discussion, get some presentations on what the impacts from the Carrizo-Wilcox might be. And some that's related to the desired future condition. A lot of times it's the groundwater modeling tools that are used to evaluate those impacts, or some of it's very conceptual. Now the order we're going to go is we're going to first have Kevin up here, then we're going to have Chad, and we're going to have Toya. I've asked them to each speak for about 15 minutes in the hopes of having some time at the end for us to, for y'all to ask questions of the panel. I'm going to ask the questions to remain until the end, so we can make sure each of the panel members get through the presentations and we get you to lunch on time. I'm going to go ahead and introduce each of the panel members now. Just say a few words. Of course, the bios are in your booklet, and then after that, I'll invite Kevin up. So first up, there's Kevin. Just to highlight a few things from his bio. He's a hydrogeologist and president of R.W. Hart Associates. More than 25 years experience. He's been a principal investigator and project manager for the development of more than 75 million gallons per day of groundwater supply wells in Texas. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in geology from Baylor University. After that, you're going to hear from Chad Norris. And Chad works, he's an aquatic biologist, water resources branch with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. He has a bachelor's of science in environmental geology from Houston Clear Lake, which I didn't know had a geological background. Things you learn at these things. And then, and then he's got a master's degree in aquatic biology. I always see him as an aquatic guy, not a geology guy, so that explains a lot. He's worked for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for 19 years, part of their water resources branch, where his duties are primarily groundwater focused. And then finally, we're going to end with Toya Jones, a hydrogeologist with Terra. She has 30 years of experience in areas of aquifer characterization and the development and application of numerical models for water resources, environmental restoration, and regulatory compliance projects. Her experience with water resource evaluation includes collection and synthesis of data for conceptual and numerical models. You all know what a conceptual model is now. Based on site-specific hydrogeologic information. She's a proud Aggie, I'm sure. Bachelor's degree and master's degree, both in geology from A&M. So with that, I'm going to invite Kevin up, then Chad, then Toya.
Well, Robert, thank you for the introduction. Gary, thank you for asking me to be here, and all of you for joining us in this discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about aquifers and how aquifers respond to large-scale pumping. Robert's beginning part of his presentation, where he talked about aquifers in general, should help speed me along here. First thing we're going to do is show you a little bit, talk a little bit about understanding aquifers, then get a little bit into the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, and then we're going to talk about Carrizo-Wilcox groundwater availability and reliability, and how it's responded historically to pumpage, what that means in terms of drought resistance, and how much aquifer storage we have. This is a simple animation we have here that's going to try and explain artesian pressure. If you take a simple tube, fill it with water, we understand that we have pressure there. If you tap into that tube and go up, well, first water comes out, but if I put an L on there, the water is obviously going to rise all the way up to the same level. I think we can all agree that that's going to happen. And we've established a pressure level. If we tilt this on its side and do the same thing, fill it with water, we have groundwater flowing down here, and it goes up the tube. And the water level at this end is the same as the water level in the tube. Now, if we remove water from the pipe, pressure is going to push the water up, and we remove some water, water moves down this way, and we lose a little bit of water out at the top of the pipe. And so that represents a loss of storage there as we move water from this pipe. So I think from the drawings that you've seen today, you can kind of see where this is going, how this relates to an aquifer. Of course, in this simple illustration here, this is a pipe that's a hollow pipe. It's got no resistance to flow, but if we fill this with sand or gravel or fine sand, coarse sand, whatever, it's going to have some resistance to flow, and so there may be some loss of head as it flows down to the well. Now we're going to look at this. You're probably getting tired of seeing cross sections and recharge and water table and artesian pressure. But the point I want to make here is that in the outcrop area, as Robert said, that as you pump a well there, you're actually dewatering the aquifer. So you're removing water from the grains of sand and it's going into the well. And in the artesian pressure, or the artesian portion of the aquifer, the water is, the aquifer is completely saturated and remains saturated, and we've had this pressure drop that goes along with it. In reality, when you pump two wells, the same amount of water out of them, we have a small impact because of storage, because in the water table portion of the aquifer, the storage number we said was about 1,000 times higher, holds more water per volume of the aquifer in the outcrop area versus it does in the artesian area. So when you pump a well here, you get more drawdown quicker, and the effects go out further and faster, as opposed to the water table where the reaction to pumpage is slow and easily monitored. I'm going to skip that other slide because we don't need to talk about it. These are historical drawdown in Simsboro. We see the pumping centers of Bryan College Station, Walnut Creek Mine, Alcoa Sandow, Three Oaks, Aqua, and these are this is what the model shows to be the artesian pressure decline. And if we look at hydrographs of individual wells within this outcrop area, we see right in the center of Bryan College Station cone of depression, we have this drawdown, but it goes up and down quickly. And that's response to seasonal usage. During wet years, they don't need to pump as much groundwater, so the water level comes up. During dry years, they have to pump more, and it pulls the water levels down. As you move away from the pumping center over here, you don't have those ups and downs as much, or they're not as dramatic as they are here. Finally, in the case of, this is right near Alcoa's Sandow, and you can see that when they started their depressurization operation, the water levels went down very, very quickly. And when they cut back the depressurization, they're still using some water over there, I believe, the water levels rebounded instantly when they shut that off. And so that's an important part about artesian pressure, is that it happens very quickly, responds very quickly to changes in pumpage and usage. These are selected wells that we did for the outcrop area, and what we see here is that the water levels in almost all cases are generally flat. Some of them go up a little bit, some of them go down a little bit, but all of these changes that occur to all this pumpage occur at a very, very slow rate. So the outcrop or the water table part of the aquifer gives us a good measuring tool to evaluate how the aquifer responds to long-term pumping, because these changes happen slow and we don't see the lumps and bumps due to seasonal changes. We want to know what's going to happen going forward with more pumpage. We can look at the southern portion of the Carrizo Aquifer. This is in South Texas. It's Frio, Zabala, Atascosa County. And they've been pumping over 300,000 acre feet for decades out there. And these are the Artesian pressure cones of depression. And the checkered area is the outcrop of the aquifer as it's simulated in the GAM for the South Texas Carrizo-Wilcox. And the important thing to note here is that the GAM shows up to 75, maybe 100 feet of drawdown in some areas in the water table portion of the aquifer. And so this says, okay, well, the model shows that we're losing a significant amount of storage because we see these water levels decline. But when we look at the actual water levels, what we have on the red lines going down are the simulated water levels, whereas the blue dots represent the actual measured water levels. So in this instance, the model is over-predicting what the water table decline has been, and what we see is that the aquifer water levels, which is basically the storage in the aquifer, that's our measure, has remained roughly the same. And this is another part of the southern Carrizo-Wilcox moving up to the northeast, Atascosa, Wilson, Gonzales County. And we see basically the same thing where the model is over-predicting. And you can clearly see in some of these that, yes, we are losing some storage because the water table is dropping. In GMA 12, we did some calculations on how much the volume of water in storage in the Carrizo and Simsboro. The far bar all the way over on your left is the total lake storage in Texas, 31.5 million acre feet. I believe total water usage in Texas is about 16 million acre feet per year. And then in the total between the Carrizo and the Simsboro, and we're ignoring the Calvert Bluff and Hooper, there's 331 million acre feet of groundwater in storage. And as Larry alluded to, you can't remove all that water. There's physical limitations to it with pumping equipment, its depth. You can't desaturate the entire aquifer. If we look at what happens with storage over time, and this includes all of the pumpage that's in the most recent GMA 12 GAM run, and plus the Blue Water System or the Vista Ridge pumpage, this is what the storage decline, the model shows the storage decline is going to be in the future, which is about 3.76 million acre feet, or a little over 1% of storage reduction during that time, over the next 50 years. So just to summarize this, the Carrizo-Wilcox is a very productive aquifer. It has huge volumes of storage in it. It's a resource for all of you to use. It's drought resistant. As you can see through the outcrop water levels, even through some big droughts including the 50s and the most recent drought through 2011, 12, 13, the water levels in the outcrop remain very, very stable. Artesian pressures are going to respond to that pumpage through increased use, causes a rapid response to artesian pressure, but as the drought subsides, less water is being used, then those artesian pressures return. And I just talked about the volume and storage, and basically it's a long-term, reliable supply. There's no way to pump it dry in any meaningful sense through anybody's lifetime. That's it.
As Chad's getting up there, just thanks again to Kevin, and I just wanted to emphasize a point Kevin made when he was comparing what the groundwater model was showing in other parts of the Carrizo-Wilcox compared to what was really happening. I alluded to that in my presentation when I talked about how the models, many of our models, the first generation, don't accurately reflect the recharge processes, that local recharge up in the outcrop. And so that's in part, I believe, a reflection of that process not being accurately modeled. And again, we're working to update the models to accurately reflect that. Well, the models may be wondering, Robert, why the hell didn't you do that the first time? And the reason is back when we were first developing the models, the focus was what is the water level declines around the pumping centers? And there wasn't as much concern expressed about what happens up in the outcrop and how is this pumping affecting spring flow and base flow for many of these aquifers. Since that time, clearly people are concerned about that. So we're responding by adding that functionality to the models. Chad.
And yes, Robert, I was one of those people wondering why. Thank you, Robert, I appreciate that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some groundwater dependent habitats and try and get into a little bit of modeling that the department did back when the DSC process began. Some of y'all might be asking, why is TPWD even here, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department? I get asked this a lot when I show up to groundwater districts and GMA meetings in the past. We have a statutory responsibility to protect and preserve fish and wildlife resources in Texas. Of course, fish and wildlife, like people, they depend on water. The habitats they use, certainly not just fish and aquatic critters, but riparian habitats and other habitats that depend on water are important for fish and wildlife. We've provided input to GCDs and GMAs as requested over the years. In 2006 or so, when the GMA or the DFC process got started, Parks and Wildlife made the rounds to about 12 or 13 of the GMAs. We presented and advocated for some sort of a DFC that considered spring flows or stream flows rather than just looking at groundwater level declines. I believe GMAs 7, 8, 9, and 10 did incorporate some spring flow metrics or stream flow metrics, but for the most part, as Larry said, a lot of the DFCs are based on drawdowns and desires to pump water. Groundwater surface water interactions, the main way that we see groundwater at the surface is through springs and base flows. Springs habitats in the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer are not like the type of spring habitats that most people think of, like we see in the hill country, where you have large cavernous openings with water producing streams. A lot of the smaller springs that we see in the Carrizo-Wilcox tend to form more marshy bog type habitats. The larger inputs that we get in this region are going to be the base flows. And this is really discrete type springs that are issuing into the bottom of streams and rivers. They're not as noticeable for us to see, but they're important. They're very important to maintaining natural flow regimes in streams and rivers. It's basically the natural component that maintains these streams and rivers during drought. So this is the most important time for maintaining groundwater and surface water connections is during dry times. The foundation of knowledge on Texas Springs is really based on the work of one man largely, and this is Gunnar Bruton, produced a book and a report. He largely documented the loss and decline of Texas Springs. A lot of the springs from the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer that are listed in these reports, as I said, these are smaller springs. They're not major river-producing type springs. Most of the information that we have on base flows comes from a series of reports in stream flow, gain, and loss. So basically they go out and they measure flow in streams, upstream of outcrops and downstream of outcrops of aquifers, and they can document whether or not there was a gain or a loss as that stream flows across the aquifer. These have been very important to us and others in terms of trying to assess some environmental impacts, and it's also probably been used as a component in the creation of these models in terms of drains and whether or not the aquifer and the groundwater, if one's gaining from the other or losing from the other. One thing to mention about the stream flow gain and loss studies, these aren't necessarily a pinpoint on a map where we can say it gains or loses right here. It may be a long stretch or a long reach down a river where it's gaining or losing water. So it's not as obvious or noticed as perhaps a spring habitat, as I mentioned earlier. Here's a map of the known springs in the Carrizo-Wilcox and associated aquifers. You'll notice there's a decreasing density as you move from the north to the south. And a large portion of these are in the outcrop, but we do have others that are issuing from the down-thrown portion of the aquifer, which indicates these are either artesian springs that are coming up from the deeper aquifer, or they're associated with smaller aquifer units that maybe are sitting up as isolated hills. And these are really a lot of the springs that I've seen in the Carrizo-Wilcox. We call them sandhill seeps or bogs. Talk a little bit here about the difference between some of these sandy springs and limestone springs. When I mentioned that a lot of the GMAs 7, 8, 9, and 10 that did provide a spring flow metric as a DFC, this was largely because of concerns to endangered species. They have endangered salamanders or endangered fish or whatever species it may be, and there was concerns in protecting those habitats. The nature of sandy springs, they're typically younger, they're smaller, they're less stable, they move around in response to changes in the sand. It's not a consolidated material like limestone. So you have smaller interstitial spaces. You don't really get these rare species or endangered species. Perhaps the most unique aspect of springs in the Carrizo-Wilcox is really the vegetation component. I like to think of the springs and the base flows in the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer as being important in just keeping our common species common. There is value in that. Everybody, or I like to think everybody likes to catch fish, likes to hunt deer, those sort of things, right? So we want to keep our common species common and try to keep our perennial streams perennial. That's a priority for Texas Parks and Wildlife. Some of the groundwater dependent habitats, as I mentioned, springs, a lot of the springs in this region are smaller, but they can form various different types of habitats. You may have a stream, you may have a hillside seep or a bog, you may have a pond, or you even have hyporheic habitats, which is when there's water just below the sand or the dirt. There's actually critters and little organisms that live in that are an important component of our aquatic ecosystems. But again, the largest and perhaps most important component of groundwater surface water interactions are what we could term base flow springs. And as I mentioned before, this could be occurring over long reaches of streams. And in Texas Parks and Wildlife's perspective, it's important to maintain the historical contributions that aquifers have made to our streams. This is not only important ecologically and maintaining habitats, but it's also important in terms of surface water rights. Surface water rights have been allocated based on the historical record. To the extent that we pump aquifers and alter that historical record, surface water rights will also be impacted. I'm going to talk a little bit about, what was my slides? There we go, I jumped over one. As I mentioned, back in 2007, Texas Parks and Wildlife went around to a lot of the GMAs and advocated for some sort of a stream flow or spring flow metric to be incorporated. At the time, we had an engineer working for the Parks and Wildlife Department. Unfortunately, he got tired of being in a cave looking at models and left the department, and we had not been able to replace that position. But he did do some model runs using the model that was provided to us by the consultant for GMA 12. These model runs can show you the changes in drains, and let me move forward here for just a minute, and I'll explain to you all what that means. But something that's key to remember here, this is sort of a 10,000 foot view. These models have a very coarse scale to them. When we talk about predicting ecological impacts from groundwater withdrawals, it's very difficult to say what these groundwater withdrawals would mean for my favorite fishing hole or your riverfront property. It's a coarse scale, so we know there'll be some sort of change, but it's very hard to predict precisely where those changes will be seen. As I mentioned, this model was provided to us by the consultant working with GMA 12 at the time, and an important thing to note is that the boundary conditions are really what drive the model. I don't want to get too much into all of this because Robert and other folks have talked some about some of these concepts, but essentially these are the water going in or the water coming out, the exchanges between groundwater and surface water, and the inputs to the aquifer, and as well as wells withdrawals. Here's a graphical representation of the same thing, a little bit easier to see. The direction of the arrows denotes the positive values. So you can have reservoir leakage or net stream leakage, where surface waters may contribute water to an aquifer, or you can have drains from the aquifer where the aquifer contributes water to a surface water body or stream. You also have evapotranspiration, you have wells withdrawing water, and this is sort of a real general concept here, but that sort of gives you the idea of the water balance. When I came in, I heard Robert talking about checking accounts and such, and then that's sort of getting at how we account for that. Here we have a graph that shows sort of the values that were used in the model. Rather than trying to point out what each one is, we have the recharge and wells and ET and drains and net stream leakage. The net stream leakage is one that I'm going to talk a little bit more about as we move forward here. So the big question for us as a state agency in charge of fish and wildlife, what is the potential future interaction between the aquifer, the Queen City, Sparta, Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, and rivers, streams, and lakes? Not an easy question to answer. But we know, as Robert and others have said, when we withdraw water with wells from an aquifer, that water has to come from somewhere. It's not just appearing, right? It's either coming out of storage, or it's robbing discharge, or it's reducing recharge. Again here, so our analysis was basically looking at what is the net groundwater to surface water after we've done all of these, after we've done all the math and gotten our accounting done. So what we're really looking at here, the net groundwater surface water is essentially your drains minus your reservoir leakage and your net stream leakage. So you have the water, again, the drains is water going from your aquifer to your surface water, and you have to subtract out water that's going from surface back down into the aquifer. When we run the model was run, essentially what we see is that the predictions from 2000 to 2060 will see roughly 128 CFS decline in contributions from groundwater to surface water. Now these models, when they're run, the numbers really come out in acre feet. We converted these to cubic feet per second because that's a little more representative of stream flows. Acre feet's a little bit hard to get your head around what that means when it's flowing. CFS makes a lot more sense to folks involved in surface water. So we see that there's going to be a predicted 128 CFS decline as we move forward to 2060. What exactly does that mean for the environment? Again, that's difficult for us to predict. Knowing what that means for my favorite fishing hole or for somebody's riverfront property or their pond and in their pasture, the scale of these models makes it difficult for us to predict that. But what we do know is that there will be a decrease in contributions from groundwaters to surface waters. Now, for comparison, what is 128 CFS? I don't put a whole lot of value or trust in this number in terms of its accuracy, but as the overall trend and seeing a decline from groundwater to surface water, that is a concern for us. As I mentioned, the impacts to the habitats will be unclear. We think it's going to be very important as we move forward to monitor and to learn more about the groundwater surface water interactions. I'm glad to hear the model updates. We'll be looking more at that. Sorry, let me skip forward a little more. Oh, yep, that's it. Okay. And so as we monitor more, we are hoping that there will be monitoring that will incorporate surface water monitoring into the groundwater as we move forward. And hopefully we see a large part of management as we move forward, an important part to maintaining the surface waters is drought contingency plans. That's going to be a key, and if we have drought restrictions and being able to perhaps cut back or curtail a little so that we can maintain water in our streams and water bodies. With that, I can hand it on over to Toya. I guess we're not taking questions yet, right?
Thank y'all for being here today and your interest in groundwater. And I represent the Post Oak Savannah GCD, which is the regulatory agency for groundwater in Milam and Burleson counties. And they're charged with managing, regulating, and protecting the groundwater in your counties. And today I'm going to talk about how the district and we use monitoring and modeling to assess the impacts of pumping on groundwaters in the aquifer. I'm going to talk about all the aquifers in the counties, not just the Carrizo-Wilcox, so that's a little bit different from the other people. But let's get started. I have to do it just a little bit differently. Okay, so I'm going to talk about potential impacts from groundwater pumping, approaches for managing and preventing adverse impacts, the tools we use for that management and prevention, which include, has been discussed thoroughly this morning, groundwater monitoring and groundwater modeling. So here's a view of all the aquifers in your county. I think I have a pointer right here. Let me see. Oh, yeah. So this is the aerial view looking like from overhead. So Milam County and Burleson counties. And then this is a cross section, so looking with depth in the aquifers. And so notice that this is a 50 times exaggeration, so you can see it. But basically you have the minor aquifers, the Awa-Jackson right here, the Sparta here, the Queen City, then you have the Carrizo, and then these three units of the Wilcox, the Calvert Bluff, the Simsboro, and the Hooper. And so Larry French talked about the managed available groundwater, and so that is the numbers represented by these blue bars on this chart represent how much water is available in each of these aquifers. And then, oh man, I had a problem with my presentation. We had to convert it, and it did not convert well. Sorry about that, guys. I apologize. So this is the Sparta and Queen City combined. So these yellow bars down here, you heard about the desired future conditions, and so when the Texas Water Development Board takes those desired future conditions and runs them through the model, they come up with a rate of how much can be pumped to meet that desired future condition. And so taking that amount, that annual amount, and multiplying it by 50 years, which is the planning period, that's what these numbers represent down here. So this is to meet the desired future condition. This is how much is going to come out of each of the aquifers. So you can see that for the Awa-Jackson, it's about 2% of the available water. But if you look at the combined Queen City, Sparta, the Carrizo, and the Wilcox, it's less than 1/2 of 1% of the water available in the aquifers. So the approaches for managing and preventing adverse impacts from pumping include rules that the district has put into place and then scientific investigations. So some of the rules are maximum pumping from wells, spacing requirements to reduce the adverse impacts between wells, the requirement to manage the desired future condition, and then Post Oak Savannah has established protected drawdown limits for the upper 400 feet of all of the aquifers. So they not only look at what's going on with respect to the DFC, they're looking at what's going on with respect to the shallow aquifer, the water table part, that's down to about 400 feet. And then the scientific investigations are the monitoring and modeling. So 11% of the registered wells in the district are greater than 600 feet deep, but 62% of the wells are less than 400 feet deep. That's why the district is making sure and monitoring those shallow wells, because the majority of the wells in the district are shallow, and they want to make sure that those wells are protected. So the district has a monitoring program, and this gives you a little bit of information about it. I'm not going to talk about that right now. You can read that. But we're going to look at this chart over here. And so this is a representation of how the district uses monitoring to monitor to the DFC. So here we have years from 2000 to 2060, and 2000 is the end of the current model for these aquifers, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then this is a drawdown in the Simsboro aquifer, and so the DFC, although I didn't know this till just now, but it's now 318 at 2060, and so that would be 318 of drawdown out here in 2060. And so if there was continuous drawdown in the aquifer over that time period, it would look like this line right here. But what we have is we have measured drawdowns from the monitoring wells in the Simsboro. And so if we look from drawdown since 2000, from 2000 to 2012, drawdown has been 11 feet. And then to 2014 was 14 feet, and then to 2016 was 12 feet. So what you see is the monitored information, the monitored data shows us that this is what drawdown in the aquifer is looking like, and it's very far from this curve that would be the curve to get to 300 feet at 2060. The other thing that's important to notice is that there's actually been, in the last couple of years, some recovery in the aquifer. So the aquifer doesn't always just decline. As Kevin talked about, there's sometimes when the aquifer, the water levels and pressures increase. So that's reflected in the observed data. Also, over here we have what are called the threshold levels that the district has put into place. And so they have 3 threshold levels for each DFC, for each aquifer, and they're equal to 50, 60, and 75% of the DFC. So what happens is if they start monitoring and start observing that drawdowns are reaching 50% of the DFC, they have in their management plan that they're going to change their management strategies in order to protect and make sure that this DFC is not exceeded here. One of the things I want to say about the DFC is that by state law, they're required to make the water available to reach this DFC. And also by state law, they are, I think that about state law, they want to protect so that it doesn't go worse than this DFC. And for the Post Oak Savannah District, the 2/3 of the impact on this DFC value, 2/3 of the pumping that impacts the drawdown in the district comes from your neighboring districts. For example, Brazos Valley, where the city of Bryan College Station they pump a lot of water, and so their drawdown, their cone of depression that Robert talked about, extends into the Post Oak Savannah District. So again, 2/3 of this DFC number comes from the neighboring districts. Okay, so here, again, I talked about those protective drawdown limits in the shallow zone. So not only does the district monitor the aquifer as a whole, they monitor the upper 400 feet of each of the aquifers where the majority of the wells are located. And so this shows the shallow monitoring network right now. So these are the wells they're monitoring right now. And if you look at drawdown since 2000 in the 3 formations that make up the Wilcox Aquifer, from 2000 to 2012, the drawdown was 6 feet. And then if you look at from 2000 to 2016, the shallow drawdown again is 6 feet. So in those 4 years, there was no change in the drawdown of the shallow portion of these formations that make up the Wilcox. And in fact, the Hooper had a recovery of 1 feet over those 4 years. So the district is using monitoring of the entire aquifer as well as monitoring of the shallow zone to make sure and protect the groundwater in the district. So as many people have talked about, there's a groundwater availability model that's a combined model for the Carrizo-Wilcox, the Queen City, and the Sparta aquifers. It's used as a planning tool. It was developed from 1999 to 2004. So that model is 13 years old. It's used to help set the DFCs, and it's also used to evaluate large well operation permits. And so the Post Oak Savannah GCD has been a leader in efforts to improve this 13-year-old model. And so they've actually worked since 2009 to get the model updated and improved. Some of the things that are going to be are in the works for improvement are fault representations, aquifer characteristics, how easy does the aquifer transmit water, and then surface water groundwater action, as Chad talked about. He's looking forward to seeing the improvements in that area of the model. And so the Post Oak Savannah GCD has worked with other districts in GMA 12, the Lower Colorado River Authority, the Brazos River Authority, and the Texas Water Development Board to fund the update of this model. And so here's just, I'm going to show you just really briefly some of what those updates look like. So looking at faults, there was an intensive geologic investigation that was conducted by reviewing reviewing hundreds of geophysical logs to find offset in the aquifer. And so these light blue lines represent the faults in the current model. And each of those are what are termed sealing faults, which means that groundwater cannot flow from one side of the fault to the other, or flows really, really slowly. And so with the new investigation, these black and green and red lines are the new representation of the faults. And as you can see, there's a lot of faulting in the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifers. And so also what the investigation found is only in these along these red lines is where the faults are sealing. In all other areas, groundwater is able to pass across the faults. And then we also looked at over 100 pumping tests. And so these are the locations in all of GMA 12 where pumping tests were conducted that we found the data for. And pumping tests help us in 2 ways. One, that's where we get the transmissivity number from. And it's also where we get information about the storativity of the aquifer. So we have all these tests analyzed so we can update those 2 properties of the aquifer in the new model. And also, it was through looking at these data the way a pumping test response changes if it's adjacent to a fault. And so we were able to use this information to tell us which of those faults were sealing and not sealing. The other thing is the groundwater surface water interaction. And so here is the current model, the 2004 model. It has grid block sizes that are a mile by a mile in the horizontal direction. And the new model is going to be a quarter mile by a quarter mile, meaning that there's going to be 16 grid blocks here versus 1 grid block here. That's going to give us a more accurate representation of groundwater surface water interaction. And then we're also refining how thick the layers are in the model, which helps get us a better interpretation of water levels. And the main reason for updating the model is to get better predictive tools. The better the model is, the more likely it'll match. As talked about earlier by Kevin, you saw that there was the predictions in the outcrop area for the model went way down, while actually what was observed was pretty flat. And so all of these improvements are going to help us more accurately reflect what's going on in the aquifer. And because it's used as a tool, because it's used to set the DFCs, it's really important that we use the best model that we can. And Post Oak Savannah has just been a really key player in getting that model updated. So kind of concluding, so the approaches to assessing the impacts caused by pumping include modeling, which are in the planning and permitting process, and monitoring. Because the models aren't perfect, we have to monitor to know what's actually going on in the aquifers. So that's a key component. The district is in the process of expanding their monitoring well network. They're going to increase the number of wells, increase coverage of the aquifers in the wells, increase the frequency of measurements, and start looking at water quality. What they're going to do, because there are so few deep wells in these aquifers in the district, they're actually converting old oil and gas wells to become deep monitoring wells for the aquifers. And in addition, they're also planning to drill shallow wells so they can have more monitoring points in the shallow zone where most of the pumping wells are. And then modeling activities, just ongoing support of the GAM updates, and then they are involved in an intense program to look at geophysical logs to map the aquifers so we know more about their characteristics, and to look at water quality within the aquifer. And I thank you so much for your attention, and I think it's time for questions.
Looks like we have some time for questions. I guess the way we'll do this is I'll listen to the question, I'll repeat it, and then punt it over here. Questions? Okay.
It struck me during your last presentation, and thank you very much for all your information.
Yes.
But it struck me that it sounds as if it's up by 2060 that the drawdown on that aquifer that was presented was 300 feet by that time.
That's the desired future condition.
Part of the
Yeah.
current GMA.
Correct.
And then it also struck me that currently 60-some-odd% of those wells in that aquifer are shallower wells in that 300-foot range. And you seem to be monitoring that activity quite a bit, but yet your future conditions point out that you don't really care about them by 2060 because you're going to let the aquifer go down 300 feet. Did I miss something?
So the question, did you hear all that question? I'll try to summarize, it was a long one. So the question was it appeared by the chart that we're expecting 300 feet of drawdown for the desired future condition. Looks like 65% of the wells are shallower than that.
Well, approximately that.
Or possibly shallower than that. What does 300 feet of water level decline mean for those wells? Did I summarize that correctly?
Somewhat, yes. You understand what I'm saying?
I have a bad memory.
I think you understand that.
So, yeah.
Just see, Dalton.
And so if you remember from what Kevin showed, there can be large drawdowns in the confined portion of the aquifer that are pressure driven. And then when you get up into the shallow portion, even though the deeper portion is pumping and you're getting pressure declines, the aquifer is still staying fully saturated with water. Those aren't in the shallow zone. And so the desired future conditions are an average across the whole aquifer. And so, and if you remember those little drawings he had that showed that in the water table portion of the aquifer, the cone of depression was very narrow, was very close to the well, but once you get into the deeper part, it gets further away. So the majority of that DFC condition comes from what is happening in the deeper portion of the aquifer that has very few wells and has little impact on what's going on in the shallower portion of the aquifer.
If I can remind you, Larry French showed, he borrowed one of my slides that showed a cross-section, and I showed kind of where the water level surface would be, and then he showed a schematic of what the desired future condition might look like. And if you look closely, he hinged it off the recharge zone, the down dip part, so it hinged off. And so and that's what we would expect to see happen, in part because we see that happen in other similar aquifers in the state. We've seen that happen in Carrizo-Wilcox down south. So the bigger pumping with the larger water level declines have to be deeper down to achieve that water level decline. And then how that gets, how those declines or that cone of depression expands across the aquifer is going to hinge off the outcrop or the recharge zone. I don't know if that answers your question. It does get complicated. Because recharge zone is a source of water, and so you just wind up hinging everything off of it. So it's a good thing it's there, it's a source of water, but it also helps mitigate the water level declines from deeper down.
Yeah, well, to the novice, to the layman like me, it just appeared that your future conditions are allowing the aquifer in 2060 to go down below 60% of the wells you currently have. That's how it appears.
You may have to follow up with Toya on that, because honestly, I don't know the question. There was a lady that had a question over here, that lady in the yellow shirt.
I'm really happy to see that the Texas Department of Wildlife, that our Texas wildlife is so important on this, and someone is listening to them. They live here with us and we need them. Good for you. Thank you for water.
Appreciate it. Yeah. She said, Chad, she's glad you're here. She's glad Parks and Wildlife is here. I guess she's glad we're all here, but she's especially glad you're here. Lady up here in the front, then we'll go over to So the question is, that I understand it is, we have an understanding of what the drawdowns are in our aquifer, the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer now, what they might be in the future. Do we compare that to drawdowns in other aquifers, or perhaps even consider, do those drawdowns in other aquifers impact drawdowns in this aquifer here? Who wants that? Kevin?
No, because, is this working?
Okay, just get close.
Because all the aquifers have different characteristics. Some are more transmissive and some are less transmissive. And just to produce water, for instance, the Trinity, where we had 1,000 feet of drawdown or Artesian pressure decline, just because the aquifer is so tight, it doesn't let water in there. For a productive aquifer like the Centuro and the Carrizo in South Texas, water flows into wells very easily, and so you can produce more water with less drawdown. So comparing, even within the same aquifer, because the Carrizo is so different up towards the north part of GMA 12 compared to what it is of GMA 13 down in Frio and Atascosa counties, where it's much more productive. So you can't really make those comparisons, in my opinion.
And it is possible that you could pump at one aquifer and have impacts on another one. That's certainly, okay, that's certainly possible. The transmissivity or the ability for the water to go through a confining layer, an aquitard, is generally relatively unknown. And so it's certainly possible, but we almost need to see the effects to get an idea of what that number is and then be able to simulate it. But I'm not aware of pumping in the Carrizo-Wilcox that's affected, say, the Queen City of Sparta. Are you aware?
We've done some work where we monitor, we've been pumping in Simsboro, including nested monitor wells in the Calvin Bluff. While this is during when Three Oaks was doing, when Three Oaks and Alcoa were doing some of the depressurization. And so we did some large-scale pump tests to try and measure what the impacts were. We were unable to find any connection. Of course, we're limited by time, and we may not pump as hard as we could have. If we pumped harder, it might have done something. But in our experiment that we did over the time we did it, we didn't measure anything.
I guess it's theoretically possible that it is something that we have to watch for. Okay. One more question? See what the boss says. Right over here.
Thank you. I'm glad to see Ted here also. Normal Artesian, and I work with protection of the surface water for the last 3 years. As a part of that, there were a set of water budgets that had talked about together, and we did an analysis where we looked at the change in the water budget from 20 to 2000 to 2060. What we found was that it's not so much where the water, well, it's more where is the water actually coming from the paving pump. And what we found is that the first and most of the water seemed to be changing from where it's coming from. Most of the water was actually coming from surface water. And secondly, the next amount of water that was coming from being pumped in the center was coming from other aquifers, so those were they coming in. Third was from the horizontal coming into the aquifer. And finally, the very least was from the actual change in storage, which is, we recognize that the change in storage is very small. The concern is, how are we going to manage this aquifer if we're not looking at something? Well, how do we look at the aquifer? How do we do the monitoring so that we don't damage the surface water as we pump this water and start changing that tone of ultimate, what do you call
Some
it?
depression.
Not kind of the amount of water that's actually coming from recharge that actually
Effective recharge.
gets to the aquifer. As all that pumping occurs, it seems that from that graphic that we have, most of the water that gets pumped ultimately is coming from surface water and other aquifers. How are we going to manage that in order to protect those natural resources?
I'm going to brutally summarize that question into, given that the pumping is reaching out, if you will, to the recharge zone and capturing flow from surface water systems or flow that was on its way to a surface water system, how does the district monitor for that? Is that fair enough? How do you monitor and manage that?
I guess I'm up. That's not an easy thing. I think a good first step is the updates to the model and looking more at groundwater, surface water interactions. Some of the things I've seen in other GMAs is establishing areas of concern and making sure we have monitoring wells in those, perhaps having special management zones around areas that are of special concern. One of the things I mentioned was drought management plans. The biggest time to be concerned about these groundwater, surface water interactions and the greatest contribution from groundwater comes during dry times. So formulating drought contingency plans in a way that can still provide water to humans, but leave some water in the streams or rivers. I think these models will be very important as a first step to getting to understand that more.
Then I'll just, one last comment before I turn it over, is you heard me go on and on about how wonderful water level monitoring is. Water level monitoring helps you monitor that because you're going to be able to track what those effects are. And the plot that Kevin showed was really excellent, where it showed the model for the southern Carrizo. Here's what the model shows, and here's what the data shows. And, you know, first off, it shows the model's wrong in terms of how it's interacting with the recharge zone. That's informative, but it's also going to show you whether you're having an impact or not having an impact. And so that's important. And then also, you'll be able to use that information to make the model better. So I guess what I heard from Toya was the district is looking to put in, Ken wants the last word, Toya is going to put in some shallow.
I was going to say that I didn't mean to show that as a criticism.
No, I didn't take it.
It was an observation of what we see.
Yeah, I'm not taking it as a criticism. We know we need to make the models better. And we are making the models better with time. So not taking it as a criticism at all. In fact, I think it's excellent you put that slide up there because it's demonstrated. Because the model as it currently is has that same issue here in the central part of the state. So it's great that we've got these simulations. I'm a little suspicious of the results because the model does not do a good job with the interaction between the surface water and groundwater. I'm sorry, I'm getting kicked off the stage, so.
Thank you, Robert. Ma'am, I'm sure that our panelists would be delighted to speak with you during the break if you want to find them right after. Everyone, let's thank our panelists for their fantastic presentation.